Okay, folks, so here we go. We are jumping back into the Book of Concord, the Augsburg Confession. Today we are on article, I don't want to guess the number in case I'm wrong, but 13. There we go, article 13 on the use of sacraments, and I'm just going to try and move this over onto the left side of the screen as best I can so that you can still see it. Concerning the use of sacraments, and really this is all about the use of the means of grace. They all tie into one another and flow out of one another. So we begin concerning the use of sacraments. And in the context of the Augsburg Confession, in the context of the broader Book of Concord, some people will like to say there are only two sacraments. Going by the Book of Concord alone, that's not true. There are at least three, but really, honestly, and this is something that's forgotten a lot. When Melanchthon says we can consider ordination a sacrament, if it's rightly understood, yes, I get that there is an elasticity to that language that we can consider it. There is no use of not considering it that. So honestly, like the true matter of this is we don't go around numbering the sacraments, but what we do is to say these things are indeed sacraments. These other things which have been called sacraments, we say they are not. And so the importance of that is to say that when we say concerning the use of sacraments, it's important to know what we are talking about. And so as we talk about it now, concerning the use of sacraments, it is taught that the sacraments are instituted not only to be signs by which people may recognize Christians outwardly, but also signs and testimonies of God's will toward us in order that thereby we may, to awaken and to strengthen our faith. That is why they also require faith and are rightly used when received in faith for the strengthening of faith. So let's begin and start breaking this down. So again, as to what are these sacraments? Well, as said earlier, baptism is a sacrament. Confession and absolution. Now, this has been dealt with in the Augsburg Confession. We've also dealt with it in the Small Catechism. We will deal with it again later on in the rest of the Book of Concord. It is indeed a sacrament. The Book of Concord calls it so. True, however, you will go and you will find things such as Luther in the Babylonian Captivity of the Church saying it's not a sacrament, or elsewhere saying it's not a sacrament because it's a use of baptism, which is a sacrament. We discussed that, though, in the previous episodes on confession and absolution. Ordination, is it a sacrament? It is a sacrament if we understand it rightly. So as to what's the number of the sacraments, the true answer is it doesn't matter. Stop trying to number them. But as we use them, this is the important part. As we use them, for why we use them, how we use them as signs, but not only signs. And this is the thing. What is a sign? It is an external thing which shows me something. It points me to something. In the same way, for example, that this is a sign. This is a sign that tells you of the thing it signifies, right? So and this is actually why in some churches, things like crucifixes, things like icons are called sacramentals. Why are they called sacramentals? They're called sacramentals not because they deliver something to you in the way that sacraments do, like baptism delivers something to you. Confession and absolution delivers something to you. Holy Communion delivers something to you. But things which other churches call sacramentals, these are signs. And all of this goes back to St. Augustine when he was defining sacraments. And he believed that there was like many, 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 many sacraments. He didn't believe that there was 7. He believed that there was way more than 7. And so he used to say, a sacrament is a sign that signifies, so a visible external sign which signifies an invisible internal spiritual grace, if you will. That's to add a few words, subtract a few words from his actual quote there. And the meaning of this is just, again, this tells you of something. This is not the thing itself, right? This is the sign. It's not the thing which the sign signifies. And that's a sign, right? We have other things, though, like stop signs, go signs, street lights, and these tell us to do something. So a sign is actually quite semantically elastic. there's quite a broad breadth of what a sign can be, what a sign can mean, how a sign is used. But he says here, these things are not only to be signs which people might see Christians and recognize them outwardly. Now you say, what do you mean recognize other people as Christians outwardly? Well, example one, Baptists and Baptistic Christians. So we're looking at Baptists, we're looking at a lot of Free Methodists and Wesleyans, we're looking at Pentecostals and the way that they speak about baptism as well as the Lord's Supper. But speaking just about baptism for a second, the way that they understand the sacrament of baptism is actually, first of all, not as a sacrament, because they say it doesn't give anything. It's not, they would agree with Augustine that it is a visible sign of an internal grace, except they do not agree with Augustine that it gives the invisible grace. And that's the difference there. And so they're saying it's an external sign that the person has the invisible spiritual grace of salvation, for the purpose of, this is the Baptists, by the way, not us. We don't think this is true, but they would say, and they do say, that it is for the sake of other people viewing that and saying, okay, I see that they are a Christian because they have this outward profession of faith in baptism. That's how they understand it. And so Melanchthon here wisely says, no, that's not it only. Now, true, it is in part that. However, it's not to the exclusion of the second part of that concept from St. Augustine, which is that this visible sign actually gives the thing. And so it is indeed an outward sign, but only insofar as it's the outward sign that the spiritual grace is given, not that you already have the thing. And so we don't baptize because someone is saved. We baptize to save. That should make sense to you, I hope, right? And yet also it is a calling card, if you will, or a sign that one another, because it gives the thing. It's kind of like saying, have you eaten? If I see you eating, you have eaten. If you're very fat, I see you've eaten, right? Something like that. In that way, because baptism gives the thing it signifies, because it gives you salvation, because it regenerates you, so also in that same way, we would say, and we would look at those who are baptized, have been baptized, and say that I recognize you as a Christian because you have been made a Christian by baptism. So he says here also, but also as signs and testimonies of God's will toward us, in order thereby to awaken and strengthen our faith. And this is something that the Dutch Reformed would really like and really agree with us in. And I guess also like Reformed Anglicans and Presbyterian, higher church Presbyterians as well. And some people might say, what do you mean higher church Presbyterians? You have to be really in that world to understand what I'm talking about. But the way that they speak about sacraments are like that, in that they are visible sermons. But they don't, again, there's this blockage there where they're not going to be able to accept that the sign actually gives the thing it signifies. And so they're saying, yeah, well, it's kind of like it tells you, it's a sure sign and testimony of God's will and grace to you. It's a seal of the gospel given to you, but it doesn't actually do the thing it signifies. And so even with this language of awakening faith and strengthening faith, and this is usually where the Reformed people, or people who speak about sacraments only in this way, end up falling into only ever speaking of the sacraments as something that strengthens a faith and a salvation that's already there. And notice they're not saying it doesn't awaken it. That's just, if you say awakens and strengthens, that's usually where you're going to end up going to, right? But then you also lose some of the richness of what was discussed especially in our small catechism series, where we were talking about the absolute importance of the Lutheran difference, let's call it, among other churches which would call themselves Protestants, in that they don't have the assurance that when the Eucharist is given, that salvation is given, that when baptism is administered, salvation is administered. And so they're always saying, yeah, I've received it, but do I have the faith? And so these things are not, we can't look at them, they would say. We have to look at our faith, and this thing can awaken faith in me, but really it's the faith that I'm looking for. And this overemphasis on faith ends up what would you say, abstractionalizing our salvation, and also making it invisible, ungraspable, unfindable. And thus faith becomes law. But he goes on with this faith thing. And he says that is why they also require faith. So he's saying the sacraments require faith, and they are rightly used when received in faith for the strengthening of faith. But again, I want to caution us here with this language. They're not just received in faith for the strengthening of faith. They are received in faith, and they themselves create faith, as he said already. And they themselves, this is the thing, are received in faith because they are the gospel given. Because faith itself, what is faith? It is a trusting, a grasping, a receiving of something given. And in this context, that's the promise, right? And so the sacrament, the best way we can speak about the sacrament is the promise. The sacrament is the thing. The sacrament is the gift. The sacrament is the salvation given. Yes, it needs faith, but it needs faith in the same way that, well, not in the same way, but let me just say it this way, and we're not in the large catechism yet, but we are going to get there eventually after we cover several other things. But there, when Luther is talking in the large catechism about baptism, what he says there is that baptism, yes, it's the gospel, but it's the gospel given. And he says this also in Large Catechism, Article 3 of the Apostles' Creed, when he's talking about the sanctifying power of the Holy Spirit. And he says there, and by the way, that doesn't mean what the evangelicals and the Reformed say it means. But what he's saying is that the gospel, it's true. The gospel itself is true, that you have been redeemed by the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. That's true. But unless you are made known, unless you are given that truth, unless that truth is made known to you, you won't benefit from it. And so, like people who are sitting in prison, you might have been pardoned, but unless you hear of that pardon and free yourself and walk out of that jail, you will still be as though you had not been pardoned. And so there's something crucially important about you receiving the knowledge of this grace, receiving the knowledge of that salvation. That's actually not only super important, but it's essential to that working itself out in your life. And if that does not happen, it will not work itself out in your life. And so this is the thing, that the sacrament is the communication, it is the giving, it is the receiving as you receive it of that salvation. So just so Christ died for you, now also St. Paul says in Romans 6, in baptism, you are buried with him into that death. Christ rose from the dead for you, but now also St. Paul says again in Romans 6, with him now you rise in that baptism. In the same way, Jesus poured out his blood for you to pay for your sins. Now also in that blood, which is the new covenant given for you, you receive it in the Holy Eucharist. And this is the same way, again, this is why I said this is not just concerning the use of sacraments. If we think that they are, if we think this article only has use for us when talking about sacraments, we're going to miss like half of the purpose of this, right? But in the same way that this is instituted just as the preaching office is, right? That the use of sacraments is the same thing as the use of preaching and the use of the word read, right? It's to awaken faith. It's to strengthen faith. It's to save souls. It's to forgive sins. Now, in this second part here, you see there is a rejection. And my Zoom bar is down, so I can't navigate around and open up the Latin translation to see if because sometimes the Latin translation is a little harsher and condemns those who are rejected in the German version. But here it says, rejected, therefore, are those who teach that the sacraments justify ex opere operato. And ex opere operato means by the work itself being worked without faith, and who do not teach that this faith should be added so that the forgiveness of sins, which is obtained through faith and not through work, may be offered here. So let's break this down and let's break it apart. This has to do with Roman Catholics. It also technically has to do with the Orthodox Church, at least in the mind of Melanchthon the Confessor. Though we're going to get into why it's more complicated than that. So by the work being worked, some people, let me just say this first. Some people assume that this means, again, just what the Reformed mean by it, that it has to do with the idea that the sacrament itself does something, and they say, no, it's not the sacrament, they say, doesn't do anything, but faith does something, and the sacrament gives you faith, okay? And then the faith justifies. This is one way of understanding it. which I think is just flat wrong. Another way that that's articulated, and I know some people will say like, "Oh, that's in Luther," whatever. It's still wrong. The other idea that you'll find is that the sacrament doesn't do anything, but this is a Reformed idea, that it is a sign of the gospel, and your faith works on this sign, if you will, to make not the sign do something, but that your faith working on the sign does something, if you will, kind of. And this is a propositional worldview. But the sacramental worldview is creative, it's performative. And this is, again, this is not just to do with sacraments, it's also to do with the word read and preached. That as God speaks, stuff happens. And so also in the sacraments, right? For as we confess in the Small Catechism, how do the sacraments work? By the word, right? Not by the water, but the word, and faith trusting this word of the water. And so the matter is this: some see this condemnation of ex opere operato, or rejection of ex opere operato, as a rejection of the idea that the sacrament itself does something causally. That's wrong, right? That's not what the rejection here is about. The rejection here has to do with something that doesn't really happen anymore. And though we have accounts that it was happening in Luther's time, and this was the idea that you could go to the Mass without any faith, and just being in the presence of the Eucharist, the Eucharistic service, something good will happen for you, or something like that. Or even those who are not. This was articulated by theologians and pastors, and still is to an extent, in regard to ritual masses for the dead in the Roman Catholic Church. But in regard to like you going without faith to a mass and having it do something for you, that has only ever actually really been rejected by the Roman Catholic Church. So really, I guess what would be said about this is that with so many things in the Book of Concord, the condemnation really is falling on peasants' misunderstandings, rather than official teachings, or what was supposed to be, I guess, the truth, right? Rome also believes that faith comes from the sacrament, that faith is had in and through the sacrament. And so this idea of a sacrament working apart from faith doesn't really exist anywhere. It's though again, it did with peasants who misunderstood such things. But yeah, I think that's the most important thing that we can understand about this. And the idea also is that the notion that the sacraments are nothing without our faith is not true. But the truth of the matter is that the sacraments rejected, that is without our faith, do not benefit us at all. And that's a crucial, important distinction to make. Some would call it a nuance. I don't want to call it a nuance for obvious reasons. I don't really like those nuance bros. But yeah, and that's a lot to think through. It's a lot to deal with. So I'm not gonna go on forever. I'm gonna let you soak in that and deal with that. But yeah, so I guess my final word here is, as with all things, just reminding you again, the Augsburg Confession is not as helpful to us here as the catechisms are, and that's for obvious reasons, right? A lot of things are being assumed in the Augsburg Confession on the side of Roman Catholic history. This is a document that's not only older or earlier, I should say, than the catechisms, but it's also for a very different purpose. It's for a very different demographic. This was not used for teaching the faith like the catechisms were. Rather, the Augsburg Confession, just to say it again, because I know it's been a while since we had our first episode on this. We're on episode 13 now, right? All the way back to the beginning. Remember, this was used as a political document to plea to Rome to not excommunicate us, that we are part of the Roman Catholic Church. And so really all that they are saying, all that we are saying here really is that the sacraments and faith go together. That's it. That's what it's about, right? That just with the word, you cannot hear the word, reject it. That's what it means to not have faith. Reject it and say it's doing something for you to your good. Like, sure it is, but you're not receiving it. And so it's not going to benefit you. That's the whole notion. But again, this is like this three-step process. I'm not good at math. Two-step, three-step, whatever. So you by yourself, you are in prison. Let's say you're well. Let's not use any metaphors or allegories. You need to be saved. You're a sinner. Okay, Jesus Christ died for your sins, but you need that given to you. You need it communicated to you. So then comes the office of preaching and the sacraments. They do the same thing. They communicate the cross to you, but if you reject that, it's nothing for you. And so the cross, the communication through the means of grace, and faith, they all go together, right? This is the ground of grace, the means of grace, and the reception of grace through faith. And that's three-step process. All right, so I know it's complicated. So if there's any questions, feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Pastor Roland. We will try our best to answer any questions that you guys have. And yeah, God bless you. Next time we come together, we're going to be talking a little bit, not a lot, about Article 14 and church government. All right, take care.